Okay, welcome to part two of week four, Education and Resistance, Post-Colonial Challenges, Indigenous Practices. In this second part of the lecture, we will be discussing a little bit the question of documentary in Canada before we turn to our discussion of Kanesatake, 270 Years of Resistance, and then concluding with some questions and discussion topics. So, just to say a little bit about the role of the documentary in Canada, um, the world famous National Film Board of Canada, or NFB, was founded in 1939 under the government of William Lyon Mackenzie King, um, with under the guidance and organizational skills of the British documentary filmmaker and organizer who had developed his career since the late 1920s or mid 1920s, excuse me, John Grierson. He was the first commissioner of the National Film Board in 1939 at a period of course, of a world that was soon, Canada was soon going to join Britain in the Second World War. So the mandate of partly of mobilizing Canada for war was also part of the mandate of the National Film Board at its beginnings. Now, the another significant aspect related to this of the educational mandate of the NFB was, as it has been famously put, to quote, explain Canada to Canadians. Right, Canada is a very large country and had a relatively sparse population, especially in the late 1930s. And part of what the NFB was supposed to do was respond to um, the um, social needs and governmental needs of the country and to represent itself to itself. And this way, we could roughly say that it had a social rather than a set of commercial interests. It was going to produce educational films rather than strictly entertainment films. And this was in sharp contrast to the American, specifically Hollywood, hegemony over cinema screens and entertainment in both the United States and Canada as well in the middle part of the 20th century. And we could argue even today. Now, this quote of all is a very that Jerry White cites in his article on Alana Sabamsuin is perhaps encapsulates neatly some of Grierson's objectives for the National Film Board. And so he wrote in 1944, quote, that every year we make hundreds of short films which describe the life of the nation. They describe Canada's achievements in industry and agriculture. They go into the various problems of finance and housing and labor and nutrition and child welfare. They progressively cover the whole field of civic interest, what Canadians need to know and think about if they are going to do best by Canada and by themselves. So this is really part of a national self-imaging, right? Information about Canada for Canadians and to Canadians, and also to build an image of itself with its and to speak to itself with its own images. And this is where Jerry White starts in his discussion of Alana Sabamsuin and her filmmaking practice, the Indigenous filmmaker Alana Sabamsuin, under the sort of auspices of Grierson. And this is why he would write, for example, that following Grierson, quote, it seems reasonable to say that Alana Sabamsuin makes films about the life of the nation. His belief that film should illustrate, quote, what Canadians need to know and think about if they are going to do best by Canada and by themselves, end quote, is a fair summary of her project. She just has a different idea of what Canada is. And this is important. Her films complicate the national self, and in so forcefully putting forth an imagining of a different kind of nation and demanding that it be given an equal place at the table, she disrupts some basic assumptions about Canadian life. So this is very important because Abamsuin following the Grierson line since the origins of the National Film Board of Canada going back to 1939, and in a way its colonial project, she in many ways follows that line of education, of building an image, of self-imaging through the documentary form, and speaking to a community, but she speaks to the indigenous community in particular, first and primarily through her films, right? So a different sense of the nation and the peoples of Canada. So if the National Film Board of Canada and the Grierson model proposes to construct a national self-image, then Obomsawin's subjectivity, which speaks from within to a different national community or a people or a we, right, to which Obomsawin herself belongs, it is a sort of self-imaging and a self-fashioning, a national self-image. And we'll return to this. And so Obomsawin, according to White, then serves as a much-needed bridge between traditions of social or pedagogical and political agitational documentary. Her Griersonian sensibilities should not be downplayed simply because Grierson himself has fallen out of favor. This is because, so White here is alluding to the fact that John Grierson has been seen now by many people in the documentary field. He's no longer so much celebrated as critiqued as somewhat of a, technocrat, conservative in his notion of Canada and of what the documentary should do, that it should really be about, as Gaines also in the previous article I asked you to read, Political Mimesis, that, the documentary merely serves to deliver information. It's rooted in a kind of analytical and cognitive set of sensibilities rather than the body. But nevertheless, at least according to White, much of this there's still aspects of the legacy of the Griersonian educational documentary that can have political value, such as we see in the work of Elias Obomsawin. Now, of course, this is related to what White identifies as the importance of reception to the documentary project. And this relates to the idea that a documentary isn't just like let's say, a work of art that, in a way, the traditional work of art, like a painting, for example, that seems to be arguably sort of complete unto itself, right? A beautiful work of art stands in itself, in its objecthood, and is finished and is beautiful. Whereas, the educational documentary film, if we focus on the question of reception, is always has a continuing life. Is never, in fact, done until is never really done, in fact, but is constantly being taken up into different educational contexts, right? And so its life continues, right? And in this way, though, it's not so much about the beauty per se of any one given documentary film as it is of how it circulates amongst those people that it speaks to and represents and imagines. And that's why this can be connected to the question of what is termed Aboriginal media, right? Aboriginal media is significant because, among other things, it makes us think about very specifically the relationship between production and reception, of who is making the images and who has access to them and is watching them. And this is why Faye Ginsburg, White draws on Faye Ginsburg and her essay Mediating Culture in order to draw particular attention to what Ginsburg calls the discursive space for Indigenous media, images of Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples all over the world, in this case Canada, that circulate amongst Aboriginal people and helping to form their own educational networks. Right? He calls it a discursive space. This is a space of writing, of education, of sharing knowledge and information and images and so forth. And this way it becomes part of a feedback loop between the political groups and activists and the images themselves that circulate around them, right? They feed back into one another. Okay. So this also then takes us to the question of subjectivity in and of the documentary and its relationship to the community that it circulates within, which is very important to Obomsawin's work. So this can be, White writes that Kanasatake is a film whose analysis is based in an illustration that much of the conflict was about different ideas of nationhood, right? The sort of broad, abstract idea of nationhood represented in part by the Canadian federal government and the military and the commercial interests, the Quebecois sovereigntist provincial government that also wanted to have sovereignty from Canada, that wanted to declare itself as its own nation, and had the Sûreté Quebec de Quebec, and of course, and the Quebecois people who lived in that area, and then of course the Mohawk peoples of the region, who also had their own sense of nationhood, belonging, and community. Now, what is in particular important, though, in thinking about subjectivity in this film is the how it produces meaning. And in a way, this question of subjectivity in Kanasatake 270 Years of Resistance should help to break us from what is in many ways the false problem of objectivity in the documentary. This is a film, Kanasatake 270 Years of Resistance, that specifically speaks to in a first-person voice, so Bong Soon-in's own voice, right? And so it doesn't make per se any kind of naive claim to being simply, neutral. It is a motivated and committed film that is speaking to a particular set of concerns with a specific political objective in mind. But this in no way means it is not addressing reality. Or accurately depicting a certain struggle. It is just part itself of that struggle and speaking to a community involved and emerging from a community involved in that struggle. And so this is why White draws attention to Bill Nichols's concept of the performative documentary, which is one that, quote, stresses the subjective aspects of classically objective discourse, right? The subjectivity and performativity of Bong Soon-in's film is part of its documentary and educational practice, right? And so notions of we or our people are significant for this practice because they actually make up what is the film's voice. And so they are part of its political commitment as well as part of its educational mandate. The voice emerges from and speaks to the community that it emerges from. As White puts it, Bong Soon has said that the most important part of her making Kanasatake was that there had to be a document that came from us. That was crucial. And so, as White also puts it, less than an attempt to be the definitive voice, Kanatake was a distinct voice, one among many, and one that finally would allow the people under siege and their compatriots to give their side of the story. And so, Bong Soon's subjectivity is embedded in a particular community and speaks to that community and cares for that community. And so this relates to also the questions of aesthetics and form in the documentary. And White writes that even though Bong Soon-in's films seem formally simple and straightforward, they represent a significant transformation of documentary aesthetics in Canada, although still essentially within the framework of a Gersonian idea of form. She takes what she finds valuable from the Canadian tradition of documentary, low budget production, a fusion of, as opposed to a choice between interviews, observational techniques, and voiceover, and adds what she needs for her activist project emphasis that this is her speaking in the voiceover, that these films are foremost for our people, secure in the knowledge of who that is. So, what are some of these key aesthetics and forms of Bong Soon-in's performative practice that speaks to of her own subjectivity inside of a we, right, inside of a people? That addresses a community as a member of that community? Well, her voiceover, which is both informative and subjective. Her observational handheld cinematography, which captures events on the fly in very much the cinema verite mode. But this is also mixed with interviews. As White puts it, natives speaking for themselves uninterrupted. This uninterruptedness is an especially important part of her form because it has a way of slowing the films down. People are allowed to complete thoughts even when they're awkwardly phrased or take a long time to get out. quote. And so, even the way that she uses interviews, which is a very conventional form in interview, right? We see that in the nightly news, but it can be contrasted with the news, not only because it actually contains, interviews with people who we may not, indigenous peoples that we will not always hear from in the nightly news, but also the time and the length of time that is given to individual people to express themselves, to formulate their thoughts. This is a different pacing, a different sense of duration than the conventionalized formats of uh, televisual news and many documentaries. Obamsawin also deploys historical reconstruction to take us into the past, to set up the deeper historical background of what happened in Kanasatake or Oka, in the early 1990s. And she does this through, in this film, old paintings, etchings, and photographs with her voiceover characterization. And these are just some of the images, which are themselves historical documents that are taken up in Kanasatake to provide a sense of the historical background to the struggle. Now, finally, she also uses found or Obamsawin uses found or appropriated footage that is and recontextualized by virtue of its insertion into the film's overall argument. An example of this would be the TV interview with Brian Mulroney in Kanasatake, which reveals his comments to be very self-centered and egotistical. If we see them in their a new context that reveals the various dimensions of the struggle and not the one side of the story that the Mulroney government at the time was preferring. And then finally, Obamsawin also deploys reenactments, not in Kanasatake, but in other films like Richard Cardinal, which Jerry White discusses in his article. So what about Kanasatake and Jane Gaines's notion of political mimesis? Well, for starters, we can consider White's observation that Obamsawin's, quote, voiceovers may echo the conventions of documentary form, but their effects are the exact opposite. They assert a specific cultural identity rather than hide behind a faceless, false objectivity. And he goes on, instead, they contribute to an awareness of the filmmaker's hand, and this awareness itself helps us to make clear that this is a work not simply of objective documentation, but of intentional, agitational, and perhaps even propagandistic activism. And I'll just simply note here, you notice the question of something not being faceless, but of having a face, of having presence, right? And this emphasis on the voice of the filmmaker, both in the sense of actually hearing Obamsawin's voice herself, but also the film of having a particular point of view, as well as what White calls this filmmaker's hand being present. All of this, right, is again a very bodily, embodied sense, right, that the film is giving us of people engaged in a struggle. The filmmaker herself engaged in a struggle, right? And being present to this and speaking to us, to a people. So then, Gaines, to bring Gaines into this conversation, we can also think about this, the question, the way the armed standoff is played out and represented by Obamsawin in terms of, quote, what Gaines says, quote, how violence is theorized as a discourse and a strategy, but also as a kind of bodily analysis whereby the people come to grasp the situation through action. This action then becomes a pattern that gives itself to be read on a large scale. Part of the challenge for a committed documentary, and I argue like Kanasatake, 270 Years of Resistance, then is to image back in such a way that the structure of the colonial mirror, this is of course Frantz Fanon's concept of the colonial mirror, itself becomes visible, right? So, put it very simply, I'm saying that we can insert the title of Kanasatake into Gaines's argument, which is what I've done here, in order to say how this film is also giving us a sort of reflection back to the Griersonian model of the documentary, the Griersonian idea of the nation, of what Canada is, and inhabiting this Griersonian form, as White has argued, right? The way Obamsawin's film inhabits the Griersonian educational model building of self-reflecting a nation, but it's not Canada as Grierson or the conventional documentary conceives of it. This is the Indigenous people, the Indigenous nation, the Mohawk nation inside of Canada, and therefore it is producing a kind of schism insofar as the traditional documentary could understand it as a nationalist discourse, right? This is of the Mohawk people and more broadly the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the questions of their sovereignty and their education and them speaking of Obamsawin speaking to them and with them as part of them, right? Which in some ways is this imaging back, and to use Gaines's language, of the colonial mirror. So this takes us then to an interesting comment, an interesting quote that Gaines draws from in her essay, Political Mimesis, from the black film theorist and historian Manthia Diawara, and he's writing about Black British cinema, but perhaps this quote also speaks to some of the post-colonial struggles that Obamsawin is documenting, the dimensions of post-colonial struggles and questions of Indigenous sovereignty that Obamsawin is addressing in Kanehsatake when he writes, this is Diawara, "There we have it. Violence is a system or a machine, or yet a narrative of which the individual desires to be a part in order to participate in the reconstruction of the nation." And so I want to just extend this line of thinking into a couple of different directions. Obamsawin shot a lot of material around the Oka crisis and the crisis of Kanehsatake. And so she not only released Kanehsatake 270 Years of Resistance, but also, amongst others, three other films, including 2000's Rocks at Whiskey Trench, and then prior to that, Spud Wrench Kaninakwe Man in 1997, and in 96, My Name is Kahen Tiosta. And so these are different ways that Obamsawin's work was branching off and giving us different fragments and portraits of different aspects of the struggles surrounding Oka at that time. And we can also then think, with the Diawara quote in mind, about participating and extending beyond the struggle into even our contemporary moment with such struggles, Indigenous struggles over the land and sovereignty, with the Wet'suwet'en conflict and protests of 2020 that were regarding, amongst other things, the pipeline that was going to be installed on the Wet'suwet'en land in BC that was unceded territory, so which was effectively illegal, and the Canadian government's support for the oil pipeline, which was protested across Canada by various supporters of and Indigenous groups, which in many ways seems to sort of carry on this struggle. And we could think about how the images themselves that would be circulating in Indigenous and activist networks is itself part of participation in this struggle, right? And through Gaines, we could also think about how these images of seeing people, struggling against police oppression could be ways of, also motivating supporters to continue to keep up the fight. Okay, so this then takes us to our four questions that I want to help spark discussion. So I will go through these very quickly. Now, in her article, Political Mimesis, Jane Gaines considers the role of what she calls sympathetic magic, or also mimicry, in the production and reception of images of conflict and political activity in documentary media. Describe your response to any of the films or images seen in class from this week or previous weeks in terms of the notion of sympathetic magic or political mimesis. In addition to providing information and making you think, how did or do these images make you feel? Second, discuss a recent political event in terms of the documentation and representation of conflict. What are some of the differences or similarities between different sources, including the TV news, social media, and activist documentaries, showing the same conflict? Third, consider the relationship between oral culture and tradition as depicted in Kanasatake in terms of education and the production and reception of the film. In what ways does the documentary's use of the voice, in various senses, speak to Gaines's notion of sympathetic magic or political mimesis? And finally, consider the reception of Kanasatake for non Indigenous and other Canadians. What do you think Obamsawin's representation of the history and events of Oka means for viewers now? So I look forward to discussing these and other questions and topics with you um, in our synchronous discussion at 2 p.m. on Friday. Thank you.